Chantal Ilbury and I wrote the book The Mind of a Fox in early 2001. And the reason we called it The Mind of a Fox was to try and get across to people that you can't just play different possibilities about the future. That's daydreaming. What you have to do is examine the impact of those possibilities or scenarios on you as an individual or your business. And then you've got to decide on what the best options are in light of the scenarios. So you can't just do the daydreaming. You've got to examine the consequences, particularly if the probability of a scenario increases because the flags are rising on that scenario. And the way we give advice to our clients right now on the three scenarios we offer for South Africa, which are staying in the Premier League of Nations, secondly, moving down into the second division, and thirdly, becoming a failed state. The 50% probability we apply to Premier League. We say the best opportunity for most South African companies is to chase the changing nature of Africa, because there's lots of opportunities now in Africa. ShopRite Checkers has made huge strides in Africa. And so, being the largest economy in Africa, the natural place for companies here to expand their marketplace, whilst we remain in the Premier League, is elsewhere in Africa. Equally, we're in a very competitive world where it's probably going to be fairly flat for the next 5 years, and therefore we have to offer value for money, not only as a company but as a nation, which means you've got to have strong brands that you can justify a fairly high price for, or you offer the cheaper alternative. But that's what consumers want now. They want value for money, like an Apple i5, or they want the cheaper alternative, like Mr. Price. So those are the kind of consequences of that scenario for business today. If we slide down into the second division, which at the moment we give a 25% probability to, it really doesn't change things, because we will still be a fairly peaceful country. Perhaps the rand will have declined in value, which means offers more export opportunities for local business. So the strategy between Premier League and second division really doesn't change. Failed state, which unfortunately we now give a 25% probability to, obviously the advice to businesses is that they have to extend their geographical footprint elsewhere in Africa as a strategic necessity, or indeed build up markets overseas so that they have less dependency on the South African market. But equally, for an individual, you have the soft option of legally exporting more of your money overseas, so that you have a kind of balance between an international and local portfolio. And secondly, obviously, there are the harder options of deciding whether you're going to stay here or whether you're going to quit. Obviously, lots of South Africans have exercised the emigration option over the last 30 or 40 years. But with a 25% probability on failed state, it's obviously going to be a much greater consideration in many people's minds. But I would exercise one caution, which is that often South Africans exchange a fantastic career here in South Africa for a very mediocre career overseas. And you find that a lot of South Africans living overseas actually would want to come back here, particularly if we're in the Premier League or second division. So there is a big risk attached to that last option. But what we're saying to people is that you have to consider your options on the basis of the probabilities of the different scenarios. And then most importantly, you've got to act on those options. What you mustn't do is just have a state of paralysis. That's the whole point of this technique, because the flags are the items that take emotion out of the whole issue. If the flags go up, the probability increases. It forces you to decide what you're going to do. People often ask me what the time frame of our scenarios are. we normally say 5 years because 10 years is just too far out, and who knows where the world's going to be in 10 years' time. 2 years is too short. And particularly if you have a dramatic scenario like failed state, who knows what the timing will be and who knows what the rate of descent will be. So we're very careful to say that there's a lot of uncertainty around the actual timing of the scenario when it's going to come into play. But normally our scenarios are looking 5 years ahead. The whole reason that we have flags is that you know, we all have different opinion about whether the red flags are up or down, but we watch those red flags on a 24-hour basis. So right now, nationalisation, 6 months ago, it was still very much on the agenda, but the government seems to have walked away from that. So that's why we say that flag is down. As I said, the Minister of Health has been very sensible in discussing the implementation of NHI with the private sector so that it doesn't harm medical care given by private hospitals. So that flag is down. There's absolutely no doubt that the third flag on the secrecy bill is up because, you know, it has been tabled, and there are still clauses which a lot of people in the media find very very harmful, and therefore, you know, you might say, well, how far up is it? We can't say. You have to take an instinctive view between a flag coming up and a probability being given. There are people who say you can do a mathematical model. We say no, because the future only happens once. It's not like a laboratory experiment that you can repeat. It only happens once. And then, as I said, we haven't had land invasions in South Africa, so you cannot say that flag has gone up at this stage, even though the tension on land ownership in this country is there. On this other question of the long-term tendency of having our own version of a spring, you know, we are seeing things happen on our mines which have never happened before. We're seeing workers not answering to unions, not answering to government, not answering to employers. And so obviously what we're doing is watching how this plays out. And obviously if it leads to further confrontations, we might even raise the probability of a failed state higher. But if it is speedily resolved in a way that it looks as if it won't happen again, and if we do have an economic codessa where people really voice their grievances and we show people that the arrow is pointing in the right direction, then we will very quickly lower the probability on the failed state scenario.